video appeared on YouTube in 2012 that changed everything. The trailer showed grainy footage of rockets launching from hidden facilities, underground bases carved into mountains, and a charismatic leader shaking hands with an American president. The title promised revelations about a secret Yugoslav space program that had been sold to the United States for billions of dollars. Within weeks, the video accumulated hundreds of thousands of views. Comment sections exploded with debate. Some viewers insisted they had relatives who worked on the program. Others claimed their parents remembered the launches. The footage looked authentic, the documents appeared real, and the narrative fit perfectly into Cold War intrigue. But the entire story was a fabrication, a carefully constructed pseudo-documentary designed to blur the line between truth and fiction so completely that even skeptics began to question what they knew. This script examines the origins of the Yugoslav space program myth, traces its evolution from obscure conspiracy theory to mainstream cultural phenomenon, separates verified historical facts from deliberate fiction, and explores why this particular hoax resonated so powerfully across borders and decades. If you are ready to journey through one of the most compelling space myths ever created, hit that like button and subscribe. We begin. The myth of a secret Yugoslav space program did not emerge from nowhere. It grew from fragments of genuine history, skillfully manipulated documents, and a cultural landscape hungry for hidden narratives that could restore national pride to fragmented post-Yugoslav states. The 2012 trailer that went viral was actually promotional material for a Slovenian documentary titled Houston, We Have a Problem, directed by Ziga Virc. The film would premiere in 2016 at the Tribeca Film Festival, where it immediately generated controversy by presenting itself as a serious historical investigation while simultaneously being a work of complete fiction. Audiences left screenings genuinely uncertain whether what they had witnessed was real. The director had intentionally created what critics would call a mockumentary or docufiction, a hybrid form that uses documentary techniques, real historical figures, authentic archival footage, and fabricated interviews so seamlessly interwoven that distinguishing truth from invention becomes nearly impossible without external verification. The core narrative of the film claimed that Yugoslavia, under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito, had developed an advanced space program in the 1960s with the goal of reaching the moon before either the United States or the Soviet Union. According to the documentary's fictional storyline, this program was conducted in absolute secrecy at an underground military base known as Zeljava, also referred to as Objekat 505, located near the town of Bihac on the border between Croatia and Bosnia. The film alleged that Yugoslav scientists and engineers had successfully developed rocket technology capable of lunar missions, but that financial constraints and political calculations led Tito to make a deal with President John F. Kennedy. In this fabricated agreement, Yugoslavia supposedly sold its entire space program, including all technical documentation, prototypes, and scientific personnel, to the United States for $2.5 billion in today's currency. This money, the film suggested, was used to rebuild Belgrade and fund Yugoslavia's non-aligned foreign policy, while American engineers incorporated Yugoslav innovations into the Apollo program that eventually landed humans on the moon in 1969. The brilliance of this hoax lay in its strategic use of verifiable facts as scaffolding for complete fabrications. Zeljava Air Base was real. It was genuinely one of the largest underground military installations in Europe, constructed between 1948 and 1968. The facility was built into the Zeljava mountain and featured massive tunnels capable of housing fighter aircraft, with hardened shelters designed to withstand nuclear strikes. Hermann Potocnik, known by his pseudonym Hermann Noordung, was a real Austro-Hungarian army officer born in what is now Slovenia, who published a groundbreaking book in 1928 titled Das Problem der Befahrung des Weltraums, or The Problem of Space Travel. His designs for a rotating wheel-shaped space station anticipated concepts that would only be realized decades later and directly influenced space station architecture used by NASA and other space agencies. Tito genuinely met with American presidents, including Kennedy and Yugoslavia, did maintain a unique position during the Cold War as a founding member of the non-aligned movement, receiving aid from both the United States and the Soviet Union while refusing to join either bloc. The documentary took these genuine historical elements and wove them into a fictional narrative so compelling that it fooled substantial numbers of viewers. The filmmakers conducted fake interviews with actors portraying scientists, engineers, and government officials who claimed to have worked on the secret program. They created forged documents that appeared to show correspondence between Yugoslav and American space agencies. They used real archival footage of Yugoslav military parades, rocket tests from other countries, and space program imagery, editing them together to suggest a continuous narrative of Yugoslav airspace achievement. Most insidiously, they incorporated real interviews with elderly Slovenian and Croatian citizens who genuinely believed in rumors they had heard during the Cold War about secret space projects, lending an air of authentic testimony to completely fabricated claims. The film's viral trailer in 2012 predated the full documentary's release by 4 years, creating an extended period during which the myth circulated online without the context that would have identified it as fiction. YouTube's algorithm amplified the video to audiences interested in space exploration, Cold War history, and conspiracy theories. The comment sections became battlegrounds where believers and skeptics argued over the evidence. Some viewers pointed to the lack of any mention of a Yugoslav space program in standard historical accounts as proof of a cover-up. Others noted that the technical capabilities required for a lunar program would have been impossible for Yugoslavia's economy to sustain. Still others fell into a middle position, suggesting that perhaps Yugoslavia had conducted some space research that had been exaggerated or mythologized over time. The appeal of the myth extended far beyond the former Yugoslav republics. International audiences, particularly those fascinated by alternative histories and conspiracy theories, embraced the narrative as evidence that official historical accounts cannot be trusted. The story fed into existing suspicions about NASA, the Apollo program, and Cold War secrets. It suggested that the space race had been more complex than the simple US-Soviet binary presented in textbooks. It implied that smaller nations had played roles in technological development that had been deliberately erased from the record to serve the propaganda needs of superpowers. For citizens of Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, and other post-Yugoslav states, the myth offered something even more valuable, a source of pride in a glorious past that contrasted sharply with the economic struggles and violent dissolution that characterized Yugoslavia's end. The Yugoslav space program myth shares structural similarities with other famous hoaxes and alternative histories. Like moon landing denial, it inverts the burden of proof by claiming that the absence of evidence is itself evidence of a successful cover-up. Like claims about Nazi secret weapons or ancient alien civilizations, it takes fragments of genuine technological achievement and extrapolates them into fantastical narratives. Like all effective conspiracy theories, it provides a simple, emotionally satisfying explanation for complex historical phenomena. In this case, the question of why Yugoslavia, despite its industrial capacity and scientific talent, never developed a space program comparable to those of the superpowers. This script will systematically examine each element of the Yugoslav space program myth. We will begin by establishing the genuine historical context of Yugoslavia during the space race era, documenting what Tito's government actually achieved in aerospace, military technology, and scientific research. We will trace the origins of the myth itself, identifying when and how rumors about secret space projects first emerged, and how they were transformed into the coherent narrative presented in the 2016 documentary. We will analyze the film Houston, We Have a Problem as a work of art and as a cultural phenomenon, examining the director's intentions and the techniques used to blur reality and fiction. We will compile a comprehensive account of what Yugoslav scientists genuinely contributed to space exploration, distinguishing their real achievements from fabricated claims. We will dissect the alleged Tito Kennedy deal, examining what evidence exists for high-level cooperation between Yugoslavia and the United States, and whether any aspect of the transaction described in the documentary has basis in fact. Beyond the specific case of Yugoslavia, we will explore why myths about secret space programs prove so durable and appealing. We will situate the Yugoslav case within the broader context of Balkan information culture, where fake news, conspiracy theories, and historical revisionism have played significant roles in post-communist political discourse. We will examine how the myth has been deployed in contemporary identity politics, used by different ethnic and national groups to claim technological superiority or historical significance. We will compare the Yugoslav myth to similar hoaxes worldwide, from claims about German bases in Antarctica to allegations of suppressed Soviet space disasters. Finally, we will compile a definitive statement of what can be verified through primary sources, what remains uncertain, and what is demonstrably false, providing a canonical record that separates truth from fiction. The Yugoslav space program hoax matters because it reveals fundamental truths about how myths are constructed, how they spread in the digital age, and why people believe extraordinary claims despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It demonstrates the power of skillful storytelling to reshape collective memory. It shows how nostalgia for lost national greatness can override critical thinking. It illustrates the challenges of maintaining factual historical knowledge in an era when manipulated media can be produced cheaply and distributed globally. The hoax is not just a curiosity for space enthusiasts or Balkan historians. It is a case study in the epistemology of belief, the politics of memory, and the cultural construction of technological achievement. Understanding how the myth was created, why it succeeded, and what it reveals about the societies that embraced it provides insight into broader patterns of misinformation that shape our contemporary world. The real history of Yugoslavia in the space race era. Yugoslavia during the Cold War occupied a unique position that distinguished it from every other European nation. Josip Broz Tito, who led the country from 1945 until his death in 1980, broke with Stalin in 1948, creating the first communist state to successfully defy Soviet control. This Tito-Stalin split transformed Yugoslavia into a geopolitical anomaly, a communist nation that maintained independence from Moscow while simultaneously refusing to align with the Western Bloc. Tito became one of the founding figures of the non-aligned movement, which held its first conference in Belgrade in 1961, bringing together leaders from Asia, Africa, and Latin America who sought to chart a third path between capitalism and Soviet communism. This positioning had profound implications for Yugoslavia's economic development, military capabilities, and scientific research during the space race era. The United States and its allies provided substantial economic and military assistance to Yugoslavia precisely because Tito's defiance of Stalin served Western interests. Between 1950 and 1960, Yugoslavia received approximately $2.4 billion in American economic aid and military equipment, making it one of the largest recipients of U.S. assistance outside of the Marshall Plan countries. This aid helped Yugoslavia rebuild infrastructure destroyed during World War II, develop heavy industry, and modernize its military. The Soviet Union, after Stalin's death in 1953, also resumed relations with Yugoslavia and provided technical assistance, particularly in heavy industry and military technology. Tito skillfully played the superpowers against each other, extracting resources from both while maintaining Yugoslavia's independence from either. Yugoslavia's economy during the 1960s and 1970s was characterized by a unique system called self-management socialism, which gave workers' councils significant control over factory operations and differentiated Yugoslav communism from the centralized command economies of the Soviet bloc. This system produced mixed results. Yugoslavia achieved higher living standards than most communist countries and developed significant industrial capacity in sectors including automotive manufacturing, aircraft production, arms manufacturing, and electronics. Yugoslav companies exported goods to both Eastern and Western markets. The country became a tourist destination, particularly along the Adriatic coast, generating hard currency that funded further development. However, the economy also suffered from inefficiencies, regional disparities, and growing debt that would eventually contribute to the country's collapse in the 1990s. In the context of aerospace and military technology, Yugoslavia achieved genuine accomplishments that provided the foundation for later mythmaking. The Yugoslav aviation industry produced several indigenous aircraft designs, most notably through the SOKO and UTVA companies. The SOKO G4 Super Galeb, developed in the 1970s and 1980s, was an advanced jet trainer and light attack aircraft used by the Yugoslav Air Force and exported to other countries. The aircraft featured modern avionics and could perform roles similar to more expensive Western trainers. UTVA produced light aircraft and trainers, including the UTVA 75, which served as the primary training aircraft for Yugoslav military pilots from the 1970s onward. These aircraft demonstrated that Yugoslavia possessed the engineering expertise, manufacturing facilities, and metallurgical capabilities necessary to produce sophisticated aviation technology. Yugoslav military industry also produced rocket systems, though these were ground-based weapons rather than space launch vehicles. The M-87 Orkan was a multiple-launch rocket system developed in the 1980s and deployed by the Yugoslav People's Army. The system fired 262mm rockets to a range of approximately 50 kilometers and was designed to deliver cluster munitions or chemical warheads against enemy forces. The Orkan represented a significant achievement in rocket motor design, guidance systems, and fire control technology. The Yugoslav military industry also produced the smaller M-63 Playmen and M-77 Orkan rocket systems, demonstrating sustained capability in rocket propulsion and ballistic trajectory calculation. These weapons were exported to several countries and saw combat use during the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s and in various Middle Eastern conflicts. The existence of these genuine rocket systems became a key element in the space program myth. Conspiracy theorists and the creators of the Houston, "We Have a Problem" documentary pointed to the M-87 Orkan and similar weapons as evidence that Yugoslavia possessed rocket technology that could have been adapted for space launch. This claim contains a grain of truth, but fundamentally misrepresents the enormous gap between tactical military rockets and orbital launch vehicles. The M-87 Orkan rocket motor produced thrust for only a few seconds and carried a payload of less than 500 kilograms to a maximum altitude of perhaps 30 kilometers. Achieving orbit requires sustaining thrust for several minutes, carrying payloads of several tons to altitudes above 200 kilometers and reaching velocities exceeding 28,000 kilometers per hour. The difference in scale, complexity, and technological requirements is comparable to the difference between a speedboat and an aircraft carrier. Yugoslavia's ability to produce tactical rockets no more indicates capability to launch satellites than the ability to manufacture bicycles indicates capability to build jet aircraft. Yugoslavia did participate in space-related scientific research, but this work was conducted through international collaboration rather than independent programs. Yugoslav physicists contributed to cosmic ray research, participated in international scientific exchanges, and sent students to study aerospace engineering in both Western and Eastern universities. The Ruda Bošković Institute in Zagreb, established in 1950, became Yugoslavia's premier scientific research institution and conducted work in nuclear physics, electronics, and materials science that had applications in aerospace technology. Yugoslav scientists published in international journals and attended conferences where space research was discussed. However, no evidence exists of any coordinated Yugoslav effort to develop satellite technology, launch vehicles, or space exploration capabilities. The question of whether Yugoslavia could have developed a space program is distinct from whether it actually did so. During the 1960s, only two nations successfully placed satellites in orbit: the Soviet Union and the United States. France became the third nation to achieve independent launch capability in 1965, followed by Japan in 1970, China in 1970, and the United Kingdom in 1971. Each of these programs required investment of billions of dollars or equivalent currency, thousands of specialized engineers and scientists, extensive testing infrastructure, and decades of sustained political commitment. Yugoslavia's GDP in 1965 was approximately $15 billion, compared to the United States GDP of approximately $750 billion and the Soviet Union's GDP of approximately $500 billion. The Apollo program alone cost the United States approximately $25 billion between 1961 and 1972, roughly $280 billion in 2024 currency. Yugoslavia lacked the financial resources, the industrial base, the pool of specialized technical personnel, and the political motivation to attempt a program of this scale. The political context makes a secret space program even more implausible. Tito's Yugoslavia was committed to non-alignment precisely because it lacked the resources to compete with the superpowers in military and technological domains. The country's defense strategy focused on total national defense, a doctrine that emphasized guerrilla warfare, territorial defense forces, and making invasions so costly that neither NATO nor the Warsaw Pact would attempt it. This strategy made sense for a country that could not afford to match the conventional or nuclear forces of the superpowers, diverting scarce resources to a space program that would provide no military advantage and would likely provoke suspicion from both Washington and Moscow would have contradicted the fundamental logic of Yugoslav foreign policy. If Yugoslavia had possessed space launch capabilities, Tito would have publicized them extensively as proof of Yugoslav technological prowess and as justification for Yugoslavia's leadership of the non-aligned movement. Yugoslav scientists did make genuine contributions to aerospace and space science, but these occurred through emigration and integration into American programs. Milojko, Mike, Vucelic was born in Croatia in 1931 and emigrated to the United States, where he became a systems manager for NASA and Rockwell International during the Apollo program. Vucelic worked on the Apollo 13 mission and contributed to problem-solving efforts when the spacecraft experienced a catastrophic oxygen tank explosion in 1970. His work involved systems integration and troubleshooting, applying engineering expertise to save the crew's lives. Vucelic represents a pattern common to many countries. Talented individuals leave environments with limited opportunities and contribute to programs in nations with greater resources. This pattern is the opposite of what the space program myth suggests. Rather than Yugoslavia developing space technology that was transferred to the United States, individual Yugoslav emigrants joined American programs and contributed their talents as individuals within a much larger collective effort. The infrastructure that became central to the space program myth served entirely different purposes during the Cold War. Zeljava Air Base, designated Objekat 505 in Yugoslav military documentation, was constructed between 1948 and 1968 as a hardened underground facility for fighter aircraft. The base featured two runways, one on the Yugoslav side of the border and one on the Croatian side, connected by tunnels carved through Vucelic mountain. The tunnels could accommodate approximately 60 aircraft, primarily MiG-21 fighters obtained from the Soviet Union. The facility included maintenance hangars, fuel storage, ammunition depots, command centers, and accommodation for approximately 1,000 personnel. The base was designed to survive nuclear attack and continue operations, reflecting Yugoslavia's defensive military strategy. The construction required enormous investment and labor, involving thousands of workers over 2 decades. Zeljava's genuine characteristics made it ideal for fictional repurposing. The enormous tunnels, the secrecy surrounding military installations, the remote location, and the facility's abandonment after the Yugoslav wars created an aura of mystery that conspiracy theorists exploited. Photographs of the tunnels could be presented as evidence of rocket assembly facilities. The fuel storage systems could be described as propellant tanks for space vehicles. The massive blast doors designed to protect against nuclear weapons could be portrayed as launch bay covers. The fact that the facility was partially destroyed during the Yugoslav wars and subsequently looted eliminated much of the physical evidence that could have definitively established its actual purpose. What remained were ruins that could be photographed and interpreted in whatever manner fit the narrative being constructed. Yugoslavia's actual relationship with space exploration during the Cold War was that of an observer nation with limited resources attempting to participate in international scientific discourse while focusing its technological development on more immediately practical applications. The country invested in education, sending students abroad to study science and engineering. It developed industrial capabilities in sectors where it could compete, including automotive manufacturing, arms production, and shipbuilding. It maintained a scientific research infrastructure that produced respected work in physics, chemistry, and biology. But it did not and could not have developed a space program capable of lunar missions, and no credible evidence suggests that any Yugoslav government official ever considered attempting such a program. The historical record is clear and consistent. Yugoslav government budgets from the 1960s and 1970s show no allocations for space research beyond minor contributions to international scientific organizations. Yugoslav military procurement records show purchases of aircraft, tanks, and naval vessels from foreign suppliers, along with indigenous production of small arms, artillery, and tactical rockets, but no expenditures consistent with space program development. Yugoslav scientific publications from the era show participation in international research collaborations, but no domestic space program. Western intelligence agencies monitored Yugoslav military capabilities extensively throughout the Cold War, and declassified CIA and NATO reports contain detailed assessments of Yugoslav aircraft, missiles, and nuclear research, but no mention of any space program. Soviet intelligence similarly tracked Yugoslav capabilities, and declassified Soviet documents show no indication that Moscow believed Yugoslavia was developing space technology. The real history of Yugoslavia in the space race era is the story of a medium-sized country attempting to maintain independence and dignity in a world dominated by superpowers. Tito's government achieved remarkable diplomatic successes, created a unique economic system, and developed sufficient military capability to deter invasion. Yugoslav industry produced impressive achievements in aviation, naval construction, and arms manufacturing. Yugoslav scientists contributed to international knowledge through research and through individual emigration to countries with greater resources. But Yugoslavia did not build a space program, did not develop lunar mission capabilities, and did not sell space technology to the United States. The myth that it did so represents wishful thinking, creative fiction, and deliberate manipulation of historical facts. The origins of the Yugoslav space program myth. Every compelling myth has roots in fragments of truth that are exaggerated, misinterpreted, or deliberately distorted to serve psychological or political needs. The Yugoslav space program myth did not emerge fully formed from the imagination of a single filmmaker. Instead, it developed gradually through decades of rumor, misunderstanding, and the natural human tendency to see patterns and conspiracies in incomplete information. Tracing the origins of the myth requires examining several distinct threads: the legacy of Hermann Potocnik Noordung, the mystery surrounding secret military installations like Zeljava, the genuine achievements of Yugoslav rocket technology, the aspirational narratives of socialist propaganda, and the information vacuum that followed Yugoslavia's violent dissolution in the 1990s. Hermann Potocnik was born in 1892 in Pula, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in what is now Croatia. He attended the Technical Military Academy in Vienna and served as an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army during World War I. After the war, suffering from tuberculosis, Potocnik devoted himself to theoretical work on space exploration. In 1928, he published Das Problem der Befahrung des Weltraums der Raketenmotor, which translates to the problem of space travel, the rocket motor, under the pseudonym Hermann Noordung. This book, published in German, presented detailed designs for a rotating wheel-shaped space station that would provide artificial gravity through centrifugal force. Potocnik's design included separate sections for living quarters, an astronomical observatory, and a power generation facility using solar energy. His work anticipated concepts that would only be realized decades later and directly influenced Wernher von Braun and other rocket pioneers who designed space stations for NASA and the Soviet space program. Potocnik died in 1929 at age 36, never witnessing the space age his work helped inspire. His book remained relatively obscure until the 1950s, when rocket scientists working on actual space programs rediscovered it and recognized its visionary quality. NASA acknowledged Potocnik's contributions, and a crater on the far side of the moon was named Noordung in his honor. For Slovenian and Yugoslav sources, Potocnik represented a native son who had contributed fundamentally to space exploration despite never having the resources to build his designs. He became a symbol of what Yugoslav genius might have achieved had circumstances been different. The Potocnik legacy created a foundation for mythmaking. If a Yugoslav engineer had designed space stations in 1928, decades before any nation achieved spaceflight, might Yugoslavia have possessed other space-related knowledge that had been suppressed or forgotten? Might there have been a tradition of Yugoslav space research extending from Potocnik through the Cold War era? These questions ignored crucial facts. Potocnik's work was theoretical, produced before Yugoslavia existed as a nation, published in Austria rather than in any Yugoslav context, and represented the achievement of one. Yugoslav collaboration with Soviet and American space programs has been alleged, but is unsupported by archival evidence from any of the three countries. Declassified CIA reports on Yugoslav military capabilities from the 1960s through 1980s contain detailed assessments of Yugoslav aircraft, naval vessels, and ground forces, but no mention of space technology. These reports were based on satellite imagery, signal intelligence, human intelligence from sources within Yugoslavia, and technical analysis of Yugoslav weapon systems obtained through various means. If Yugoslavia had possessed space launch capabilities or conducted rocket tests of the scale required for orbital missions, American intelligence would have detected and documented these activities. The absence of any such documentation in now declassified materials strongly indicates that no Yugoslav space program existed. Similarly, Soviet intelligence archives declassified after the Cold War contain no references to Yugoslav space capabilities. The KGB and GRU closely monitored Yugoslavia after the 1948 Tito-Stalin split, viewing the country as both a potential threat and a potential source of intelligence on Western technology that Yugoslavia obtained through its non-aligned status. Soviet intelligence reports detail Yugoslav military acquisitions, industrial capabilities, and political developments, but make no mention of space technology. Had Yugoslavia developed launch vehicles or spacecraft, Soviet intelligence would have reported this to Moscow, and these reports would appear in the now accessible archives. The canonical truth about Yugoslav space-related activities can be summarized as follows. Yugoslavia had no space program in any meaningful sense of the term. Individual Yugoslav-born scientists contributed to American and European space programs after emigrating. Yugoslav scientific institutions participated in international space science collaborations as junior partners analyzing data collected by other nations' spacecraft. Yugoslav military industry produced tactical rocket weapons with ranges measured in tens of kilometers, which shared only the most superficial similarities with space launch vehicles. Yugoslav military planners conducted theoretical studies of reconnaissance satellite utility, but concluded that developing indigenous capabilities was beyond the country's resources. No Yugoslav satellite was ever designed, built, or launched. No Yugoslav rocket capable of reaching orbit was ever tested. No facilities for space launch were ever constructed. No agreement to sell space technology to the United States was ever negotiated because no such technology existed to sell. The Tito Kennedy deal, untangling the $2.5 billion claim. The most sensational element of the Yugoslav space program myth is the alleged secret agreement between Josip Broz Tito and President John F. Kennedy, in which Yugoslavia supposedly sold its entire lunar program to the United States for $2.5 billion in contemporary currency. This claim sits at the heart of the pseudo-documentary, Houston, We Have a Problem, and has been repeated across internet forums, social media posts, and nationalist propaganda materials. Examining this allegation requires understanding what genuine interactions occurred between Tito and Kennedy, how covert Cold War technology transfers actually functioned, what financial arrangements existed between the United States and Yugoslavia, and why this particular fiction proved so appealing despite its implausibility. Tito and Kennedy did meet, and this genuine historical event provided the factual anchor for the fictional transaction. Kennedy visited Yugoslavia in 1963 as part of a European tour designed to strengthen relationships with non-aligned nations and demonstrate American engagement beyond NATO allies. The visit was carefully choreographed for maximum diplomatic impact. Kennedy and Tito discussed regional security issues, economic cooperation, and Yugoslavia's role in the non-aligned movement. Contemporary news coverage documented the visit extensively. The New York Times published detailed accounts of meetings between the two leaders, reporting on discussions about trade, military aid, and Yugoslavia's position between East and West. At no point did any contemporary account mention space technology, rocket programs, or extraordinary financial transactions. The documentary fabricated the space deal by taking this real meeting and inventing fictional discussions that supposedly occurred in private sessions. The film suggested that Kennedy and Tito negotiated away from their advisors, conducting sensitive discussions that were deliberately excluded from official records. This narrative device is common in conspiracy theories because it explains the absence of documentation. If the most important conversations were secret and intentionally unrecorded, then the lack of evidence becomes, perversely, evidence of the cover-up's success. This logic is unfalsifiable and can be applied to any claimed secret agreement, regardless of whether it actually occurred. Financial relationships between the United States and Yugoslavia during the Cold War were extensive, but they followed documented patterns entirely inconsistent with the alleged space program purchase. American aid to Yugoslavia between 1950 and 1970 totaled several billion dollars, provided through multiple channels including the Mutual Security Act, food aid programs, military assistance, and development loans. These funds were tracked by congressional oversight committees, reported in State Department budgets, and documented in diplomatic cables. The aid served clear strategic purposes, keeping Yugoslavia independent from Soviet control, demonstrating that communist countries could maintain good relations with the West, and providing a model of a more liberal form of socialism that might appeal to other Eastern European nations. The claim that the United States paid Yugoslavia $2.5 billion for space technology collapses under scrutiny of how technology transfers actually occurred during the Cold War. When the United States sought rocket technology, it did so through programs like Operation Paperclip, which brought German rocket scientists, including Wernher von Braun, to America after World War II. These scientists came as individuals or small teams, bringing knowledge rather than hardware. The United States paid salaries and research grants, but did not purchase entire programs from foreign governments. When the United States wanted intelligence on Soviet space capabilities, it used spy satellites, signal intercepts, defectors, and human intelligence sources. It did not negotiate open purchases of space technology from communist countries because such transactions would have been politically impossible for both parties. The Soviet Union's approach to acquiring Western technology followed different patterns, but was equally incompatible with the alleged Yugoslav deal. The KGB ran extensive operations to steal aerospace technology from the United States and Western Europe. These operations involved industrial espionage, recruitment of scientists and engineers with access to classified information, and technical analysis of captured or purchased Western equipment. The Soviets occasionally purchased dual-use technology through intermediaries, disguising military applications as civilian research. However, the idea that the Soviet Union would have tolerated Yugoslavia selling space technology to the United States contradicts everything known about Soviet intelligence priorities and the Kremlin's obsessive secrecy regarding space and missile programs. Had Yugoslavia possessed space technology valuable enough that the United States would pay billions to acquire it, the transaction would have left extensive traces in American government records. Congressional appropriations for classified programs were real, and while specific projects might be hidden behind code names, the overall budget allocations were documented. The Apollo program's costs were publicly known and audited. If billions of additional dollars had been spent acquiring Yugoslav technology, this expenditure would appear somewhere in the accounts. Researchers who have examined declassified Apollo program budgets and NASA financial records have found no unexplained expenditures of the magnitude claimed in the myth. Furthermore, integrating foreign technology into Apollo would have required documentation that would persist in technical archives. NASA maintained meticulous records of every component in the Apollo spacecraft, every contractor who produced parts, and every design decision. These records have been extensively studied by historians of technology and are available to researchers. If Yugoslav rocket motors, guidance systems, or other components had been incorporated into Apollo, evidence would exist in parts manifests, technical specifications, and contractor records. No such evidence has been found because no such integration occurred. The myth's temporal logic is also flawed. The documentary claims that Tito offered to sell the space program in 1961, shortly after Kennedy announced the Apollo program in May of that year. However, purchasing a complete foreign space program in 1961 and integrating it into Apollo would have been counterproductive. By 1961, NASA had already selected the basic architecture for Apollo, chosen contractors, and begun development of the Saturn rocket family. The United States had been developing rocket technology continuously since the late 1940s through programs including the Redstone, Atlas, and Titan missiles. NASA's approach to Apollo was incremental, building on previous programs like Mercury and the knowledge base established by von Braun's team. Suddenly integrating a completely different technological approach from Yugoslavia would have required abandoning years of work and retraining thousands of engineers and technicians. No project manager would have accepted such disruption, and no evidence suggests that Apollo's development was restarted or significantly redirected in the early 1960s. The claim also misunderstands how lunar mission capability is developed. A space program capable of reaching the moon is not a discrete package of technology that can be sold as a unit. It consists of thousands of interconnected systems: rocket engines, fuel tanks, guidance computers, life support systems, communications equipment, ground tracking stations, launch facilities, mission control infrastructure, trained personnel, testing protocols, and accumulated operational experience. Even if Yugoslavia had possessed some of these elements, which it did not, transferring them to another country's program would require years of technology transfer, personnel training, and systems integration. The notion that this could be accomplished secretly while also erasing all evidence of Yugoslavia's original program defies practical reality. The alleged cover-up is equally implausible. The documentary claims that Yugoslav scientists were integrated into Apollo and that their contributions were masked by attributing credit to American personnel. However, the Apollo program employed approximately 400,000 people across NASA, contractors, and subcontractors. Tracking the identities and backgrounds of key scientists and engineers is straightforward through personnel records, published research, and biographical sources. No sudden influx of Yugoslav personnel into the Apollo program occurred in the early 1960s. The scientists and engineers who led critical Apollo systems have well-documented career trajectories showing their education in American universities and their prior work on American rocket and space programs. Financial implausibility extends beyond the alleged purchase price. If Yugoslavia had received $2.5 billion in 1961, equivalent to approximately $25 billion in 2024 currency, this influx would have been visible in Yugoslavia's economy. The country's GDP in 1961 was approximately $10 billion. An additional $2.5 billion would represent a 25% increase in national wealth. Such an increase would have produced observable effects, including currency appreciation, inflation or deflation, depending on how the money was introduced, massive infrastructure projects, changes in trade balances, and shifts in foreign currency reserves. Economists who have studied Yugoslav economic history in the 1960s see no evidence of such a windfall. Yugoslavia's economic growth during this period is consistent with normal development funded by documented sources, including American aid, Soviet assistance, domestic investment, and export earnings. The myth's creators exploited genuine ambiguities in Cold War history to make their fiction plausible. The Cold War was characterized by secret agreements, covert technology transfers, and intelligence operations that were not publicly acknowledged for decades. The United States did conduct secret negotiations with communist countries, did pay for intelligence, and did run classified programs that were concealed from public oversight. These genuine secrets create a permission structure for imagining additional secrets that never existed. If the CIA ran covert operations in dozens of countries, why not a secret deal with Yugoslavia? If billions were spent on classified military programs, why not on acquiring Yugoslav space technology? The answer is that while secrecy was extensive, it was not unlimited, and the paper trails from classified programs eventually enter the historical record through declassification, congressional investigations, and archival research. Intelligence agencies did monitor Yugoslav scientific and military capabilities. And this surveillance is well documented in now declassified records. CIA reports from the 1960s assessed Yugoslav rocket artillery, aircraft production, and defense industries. These reports show that American intelligence had detailed knowledge of what Yugoslavia was actually producing. The reports are notable for what they do not contain: no assessments of space launch capability, no concerns about Yugoslav competition in the space race, no recommendations to acquire Yugoslav space technology. The intelligence community's actual view of Yugoslavia was of a country with modest military-industrial capability, useful as a source of intelligence on Soviet equipment that Yugoslavia purchased, but not as a source of advanced aerospace technology. The myth served psychological needs for populations in post-Yugoslav states who experienced the trauma of their country's violent dissolution. The 1990s brought wars that killed hundreds of thousands, created millions of refugees, destroyed economies, and shattered the social fabric of multi-ethnic communities. In the aftermath, citizens of the successor states confronted the reality that the country they had grown up in no longer existed and that its legacy was contested. Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, and others constructed competing narratives about why Yugoslavia failed, who was responsible for the wars, and what elements of Yugoslav identity should be preserved or rejected. In this context, a myth about Yugoslav technological achievement offered psychological compensation for loss and humiliation. It suggested that Yugoslavia had been greater than people realized, that its destruction represented the loss of something valuable rather than the inevitable collapse of a dysfunctional state. The space program myth allowed people to imagine that their parents and grandparents had participated in something historically significant, that Yugoslav engineers had been brilliant enough to impress even America, and that the poverty and chaos of the 1990s resulted not from inherent problems, but from having sold off the country's greatest assets. This narrative was comforting even if false, and for many people, the emotional utility of the myth outweighed the importance of historical accuracy. The Tito Kennedy deal never happened because the Yugoslav space program it allegedly involved never existed. No technology was sold because no technology was developed. No billions of dollars changed hands beyond the documented aid programs that served entirely different purposes. The myth persists not because evidence supports it, but because it fulfills psychological and political needs. Understanding why people believe the myth despite its implausibility requires examining not just the facts of Cold War history, but the cultural and psychological conditions that make myths attractive and the mechanisms through which false narratives spread and become entrenched in collective memory. Balkanist culture, why we believe myths. The Yugoslav space program, Hoax, did not emerge in a vacuum, but rather flourished in a specific cultural and informational ecosystem that made it particularly resistant to debunking and particularly appealing to certain audiences. Understanding why this myth gained traction requires examining the broader patterns of historical memory, information transmission, and identity construction in the post-Yugoslav space. The Balkans have long been characterized by what scholars call competitive victimhood and competitive achievement, where different ethnic and national groups contest ownership of historical events and cultural accomplishments. This environment creates fertile ground for myths that serve nationalist narratives, and the space program Hoax represents one particularly sophisticated example of this phenomenon. The information landscape in Yugoslavia during the communist era was characterized by state control of media, censorship of politically sensitive topics, and the circulation of rumors to fill gaps in official narratives. Citizens developed sophisticated skills in reading between the lines of official media, distinguishing propaganda from reality, and sharing information through informal networks that bypassed state censors. This created a culture of skepticism toward official narratives, but also one in which unverified rumors could circulate widely because they could not be easily checked against reliable sources. People learned to distrust what the government said, but did not necessarily develop strong methodological tools for determining what was actually true. When Yugoslavia collapsed, the information vacuum intensified rather than resolved. The successor states each established new official narratives that selectively appropriated elements of Yugoslav history while rejecting others. Serbian nationalist historians emphasized Serbian contributions to Yugoslav institutions and portrayed the breakup as a conspiracy against Serbian interests. Croatian historians emphasized Croatians suffering under Yugoslav centralism and celebrated Croatian independence as liberation from Serbian domination. Bosnian historians struggled to construct a narrative that accommodated the country's ethnic diversity while establishing a distinct Bosnian identity. These competing narratives meant that no consensus history of Yugoslavia emerged, and citizens received radically different accounts depending on which country they lived in and which educational system their children attended. The 1990s wars created additional layers of historical contestation. Each side in the conflicts produced propaganda that demonized enemies and glorified its own fighters. Atrocities were documented by some sources and denied by others. War crimes tribunals established legal records of specific events, but these legal determinations were often rejected by nationalist populations who viewed the tribunals as biased against their group. The result was a situation in which even recent, well-documented events were disputed, creating an epistemological crisis where people lost confidence in the possibility of establishing objective historical truth. In this environment, myths filled crucial psychological and political functions. For populations experiencing economic collapse, political instability, and loss of international status, myths about a glorious past provided comfort and dignity. The Yugoslav space program myth operated alongside other nationalist myths. Serbian claims about medieval empires, Croatian claims about unbroken national continuity, Bosnian claims about unique multicultural tolerance. Each myth served to elevate one group's status and provide historical justification for contemporary political projects. The space program myth was particularly effective because it suggested technological and scientific achievement that transcended ethnic divisions, allowing different groups to claim it simultaneously while emphasizing different aspects. The internet transformed how these myths circulated and gained credibility. Before widespread internet access, myths were constrained by geographic and social boundaries. A rumor might circulate in one town or among one ethnic group, but not reach others. The internet allowed people from across the former Yugoslavia and from the diaspora to connect, share stories, and collectively construct more elaborate narratives. Forums and early social media platforms became spaces where isolated rumors were aggregated into comprehensive alternative histories. Photographs of abandoned military sites could be shared and reinterpreted. Documents could be scanned and circulated regardless of their authenticity. The collective nature of this process gave myths a veneer of credibility. If many people from different places reported similar stories, surely there must be some truth to them. The space program myth also benefited from a broader cultural fascination with hidden knowledge and suppressed truths. Conspiracy thinking has deep roots in Balkan political culture, reflecting real historical experiences with foreign domination, great power manipulation, and domestic political conspiracies. The Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and various European powers did interfere in Balkan affairs, supporting different factions and drawing borders that served imperial interests rather than local preferences. Communist governments did suppress information and maintain extensive secret police operations. In the 1990s, foreign powers did intervene in Yugoslav conflicts with motivations that were not always transparent. These genuine conspiracies created a template that could be applied to situations where no actual conspiracy existed. The myth's resilience also reflects educational deficits in scientific literacy and critical thinking. Yugoslav education emphasized memorization of ideologically approved narratives rather than analytical skills for evaluating evidence. Post-Yugoslav educational systems, struggling with budget constraints and political interference, often failed to improve this situation. Many citizens lack the technical knowledge to understand why a tactical rocket system cannot be easily converted into a space launch vehicle, or why certain claims about rocket performance are physically implausible. Without this knowledge, evaluating competing claims about the space program became a matter of choosing which authority to trust rather than analyzing evidence. Media ecosystems in the successor states have often amplified rather than corrected misinformation. Sensational claims attract audiences and generate revenue through clicks and advertising. Responsible journalism requires resources for fact-checking, access to expert sources, and editorial commitment to accuracy over engagement. Many Balkan media outlets, operating in difficult economic conditions and sometimes under political pressure, lack these resources or incentives. Stories about the Yugoslav space program could be published as curiosities without serious investigation into their veracity. Even when journalists expressed skepticism, framing the story as some people believe this extraordinary claim gave the myth publicity without definitively debunking it. Social media algorithms exacerbated these problems by creating filter bubbles where people were exposed primarily to information confirming their existing beliefs. Someone who found the space program myth appealing and engaged with content about it would be served more similar content, creating a reinforcing cycle. Debunking content, which tends to be less emotionally engaging than sensational claims, was algorithmically deprioritized. The result was that believers in the myth could exist in informational ecosystems where their beliefs were constantly validated and contrary evidence was rarely encountered. The myth also served contemporary political purposes beyond nostalgia for the past. Politicians in successor states sometimes deployed Yugoslav nostalgia strategically, appealing to voters who remembered the relative stability and prosperity of the Tito era compared to the chaos of the 1990s and the disappointments of post-transition economies. References to Yugoslav achievements, including the alleged space program, could signal a politician's commitment to restoring national greatness or resisting foreign interference. The myth became a political tool even for people who did not literally believe it, functioning as a symbol of lost potential and a critique of current failures. Generational differences shaped how the myth was received. Older citizens who had lived through the Cold War and knew that no space program existed were often puzzled by younger people's willingness to believe the claims. However, younger generations who had grown up after Yugoslavia's collapse had no direct memory of the period and relied entirely on mediated accounts. For them, the space program was as plausible as any other story about the Yugoslav era. The absence of the myth from their parents' accounts could be explained by the cover-up narrative. Their parents had been deceived or sworn to secrecy. This generational dynamic meant that the myth could gain adherents even as people who could directly contradict it from personal experience were agging out of public discourse. The cultural conditions that enabled the Yugoslav space program myth are not unique to the Balkans. Similar dynamics operate wherever populations experience trauma, loss of status, information vacuums, educational deficits, and political incentives for myth-making. Understanding these conditions helps explain not just why this particular myth succeeded, but why myths in general prove so durable and why debunking them is so difficult. Effective responses require not just presenting correct information, but addressing the psychological needs that myths fulfill and building institutional and educational infrastructure that supports critical evaluation of claims. Legacy and impact: space myth in Balkan identity. The Yugoslav space program myth has evolved from an obscure internet rumor into a significant cultural phenomenon that shapes how people in the former Yugoslav republics think about their history, their national identity, and their place in global technological development. The myth's impact extends beyond those who literally believe it to influence artistic production, political rhetoric, educational content, and collective memory. Examining this legacy requires understanding how the myth has been deployed by different actors for different purposes, and how it interacts with broader processes of identity construction in post-Yugoslav societies. The myth has been particularly potent in Slovenia, where Hermann Potocnik's genuine contributions to space station design provide a historical anchor for claims about Slovenian technological sophistication. Slovenian sources sometimes present Potocnik as evidence of a national tradition of innovation and forward-thinking that distinguishes Slovenia from other Yugoslav republics. The space program myth, even when recognized as fictional, can be invoked as a symbol of what Slovenia could have achieved had it not been constrained by Yugoslav federalism. This narrative serves contemporary Slovenian national identity, which emphasizes Slovenia's European orientation, its relatively high economic development, and its distinctiveness from the Balkan characteristics associated with other former Yugoslav states. In Serbia, the myth operates differently, often emphasizing Tito's strategic brilliance and Yugoslavia's geopolitical significance. Serbian nationalist narratives sometimes appropriate the space program myth as evidence that Yugoslavia under Serbian leadership was a major power that commanded respect from both superpowers. The alleged deal with Kennedy becomes a demonstration of Yugoslav agency and importance in the Cold War. This version of the myth serves contemporary Serbian nationalism by suggesting that Serbia's current difficulties result from the loss of Yugoslavia, and that restoring Serbian power requires reclaiming the strategic vision and independence that Tito represented. Croatian engagement with the myth reflects Croatia's complex relationship with Yugoslav legacy. Croatian nationalism traditionally emphasized Croatian suffering under Yugoslav centralism and celebrates independence as liberation. However, the space program myth creates tension with this narrative because it suggests that Yugoslavia achieved something admirable. Some Croatian sources resolve this tension by emphasizing individual Croatian contributions, such as Mike Vucelic's work on Apollo 13, while minimizing collective Yugoslav achievement. Others dismiss the entire space program myth as Serbian propaganda designed to glorify Yugoslavia and Tito. Still others embrace a more nuanced position that acknowledges Yugoslav technological capacity while insisting that this capacity would have been even greater had Croatia been independent. The secrecy surrounding Yugoslav military installations provided another thread for myth construction. Yugoslavia during the Cold War maintained extensive classified military programs. The country produced chemical weapons, conducted research into nuclear weapons, though it never built them, and constructed hardened underground facilities designed to enable military operations during nuclear war. Zeljava Air Base was the most impressive of these facilities, but similar underground installations existed throughout Yugoslavia, including tunnels for storing naval vessels, hardened command posts, and munitions factories built into mountains. The Yugoslav government deliberately cultivated an aura of military capability that exceeded its actual resources, both to deter potential invaders and to maintain Yugoslavia's credibility as a leader of the non-aligned movement. This culture of military secrecy meant that ordinary Yugoslav citizens knew their government was conducting classified projects but had no reliable information about what those projects were. In this information vacuum, rumors flourished. Workers who had participated in construction at Zeljava or other facilities knew they had built something enormous and secret, but might not have known its actual purpose. Stories circulated about underground railways connecting military bases, about secret weapons that would be unveiled if Yugoslavia were attacked, about technology obtained from both the United States and the Soviet Union that Yugoslavia was reverse engineering. In an environment where the government controlled all media and where asking too many questions could attract unwanted attention from security services, it was difficult to verify or disprove any particular rumor. The existence of the M-87 Orkan and other Yugoslav rocket systems contributed to the plausibility of space program rumors. Citizens who saw these weapons in military parades or who worked in factories producing them knew that Yugoslavia could build rockets. For those without technical expertise, the distinction between a tactical rocket that flies 50 kilometers and a space launch vehicle that reaches orbit might not have been apparent. If Yugoslavia could build the former, why not the latter? This question ignored the orders of magnitude differences in scale, cost, and complexity, but from a layperson's perspective in an information-controlled environment, it seemed reasonable. Socialist propaganda created aspirational narratives about Yugoslav technological achievements that sometimes stretched truth into exaggeration. Yugoslav media celebrated industrial accomplishments, scientific discoveries, and military capabilities as evidence of socialist superiority over capitalist systems and Yugoslav superiority over Soviet bloc communism. Documentaries and news reports showcased Yugoslav factories, dams, aircraft, and ships. Educational materials emphasized Yugoslav contributions to science and technology, including Potocnik's space station designs, Nikola Tesla's electrical engineering achievements, since Tesla was born in what is now Croatia, and other figures who could be claimed as part of a Yugoslav tradition of innovation. This propaganda aimed to build national pride and legitimize the communist system. However, it also created expectations that Yugoslavia was more technologically advanced than it actually was. When Yugoslavia collapsed in the 1990s amid devastating wars, economic crisis, and the revelation that many government claims had been false, the information vacuum intensified. Archives were destroyed, scattered, or made inaccessible. Institutions that had maintained historical records disintegrated. The successor states to Yugoslavia, including Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and later Kosovo, each constructed national narratives that selectively emphasized different aspects of Yugoslav history while minimizing or distorting others. In this environment of fragmentary knowledge and competing nationalist histories, myths could flourish because the infrastructure for verifying or debunking them had been destroyed. The specific rumor about a Yugoslav space program being sold to the United States appears to have emerged in the 1990s and early 2000s, though pinpointing its exact origin is difficult. The claim combined several elements: the Potocnik legacy, the mystery of Zeljava and other secret bases, the existence of Yugoslav rocket systems, and a new element, the assertion that Tito had made a secret deal with Kennedy. This last component provided a narrative explanation for why no Yugoslav space program was visible. It had been sold to America and deliberately erased from history. The claim that the sale generated billions of dollars explained how Yugoslavia had funded reconstruction after World War II and maintained a relatively high standard of living compared to other communist countries. This conspiracy narrative had clear psychological and political appeal for post-Yugoslav populations. It suggested that Yugoslavia had been technologically advanced enough to impress even the United States, validating national pride. It implied that Tito had outsmarted Kennedy, obtaining enormous financial benefits while letting the Americans take the risks and costs of the actual moon landing. It provided a counter-narrative to the dominant story of Yugoslav decline, suggesting that the country's later problems resulted not from inherent flaws, but from having sold off its most valuable assets. For people experiencing economic hardship, ethnic conflict, and loss of international status in the successor states, this narrative offered comfort and a sense of lost greatness. The internet transformed isolated rumors into a coherent myth. Before the 2000s, stories about a secret Yugoslav space program existed as local folklore, passed through word of mouth or mentioned in marginal publications. The internet, particularly forums and early social media, allowed people from different regions and different successor states to share these stories, compare versions, and collectively construct a more detailed narrative. Websites dedicated to alternative history, conspiracy theories, and suppressed knowledge eagerly repeated the claims. Photographs of Zeljava and other abandoned Yugoslav military sites, which became accessible to urban explorers and photographers after the wars, circulated online and were presented as evidence of space program infrastructure. By the time Ziga Virc began developing Houston, we have a problem. In the early 2010s, the myth had already achieved substantial circulation in Balkan internet communities. Virc recognized the myth's potential not as truth to be exposed, but as a phenomenon to be explored through the creation of a fake documentary that would be simultaneously obvious to informed viewers and convincing to those predisposed to believe. The director's artistic strategy was to create a film that functioned on multiple levels, as entertainment, as social commentary on how historical narratives are constructed, and as a provocation that would force audiences to question their assumptions about evidence and truth. The origins of the Yugoslav space program myth thus lie not in any single source, but in the convergence of multiple factors. A genuine historical figure whose work could be misappropriated, secret military installations whose actual purposes could be reimagined, real rocket technology that could be mischaracterized, propaganda narratives that had cultivated expectations of Yugoslav advancement, information vacuums created by state secrecy and later by state collapse, psychological needs for national pride in the face of decline, and internet communities that amplified and systematized scattered rumors. Understanding these origins is essential for understanding why the myth proved so durable and why it could be transformed into a convincing pseudo-documentary that fooled substantial audiences despite being complete fiction. Houston, we have a problem, the pseudo-documentary. In 2016, Slovenian director Ziga Virc premiered Houston, We Have a Problem at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York, presenting audiences with a meticulously crafted work that defied simple categorization. The film was marketed as a documentary investigation into a secret Yugoslav space program allegedly sold to the United States during the Cold War. It featured interviews with apparent historians, scientists, and government officials. It presented archival footage, documents, and photographs that seemed to corroborate its extraordinary claims. It maintained the formal conventions of serious documentary filmmaking throughout its 88-minute runtime. Yet the entire film was fiction, a deliberate hoax constructed to explore questions about truth, evidence, national mythology, and the malleability of historical memory in the digital age. The film's central narrative claimed that Yugoslavia developed a lunar program codenamed Project Lunar in the 1960s under Tito's direct supervision. According to this fictional account, Yugoslav engineers working at the secret Zeljava facility designed and tested rocket motors capable of achieving lunar trajectories. The program allegedly achieved several successful unmanned test launches from a secret site in the Adriatic Sea. However, as costs mounted and the technical challenges of a crewed lunar landing became apparent, Tito recognized that Yugoslavia lacked the resources to complete the mission. In 1961, shortly after Kennedy announced the American commitment to landing a man on the moon, Tito supposedly contacted the American president and offered to sell Yugoslavia's entire space program. The film portrayed this transaction as a complex secret agreement negotiated between Tito and Kennedy during the president's 1963 visit to Yugoslavia. In the film's version of events, Kennedy agreed to purchase all Yugoslav space technology, including blueprints, prototypes, test data, and the services of key scientists, for a sum equivalent to $2.5 billion in contemporary currency. This money was allegedly paid through covert channels to avoid alerting the Soviet Union to American-Yugoslav cooperation. The Yugoslav space scientists were supposedly integrated into the American Apollo program, where their contributions were masked through reassignment of credit to American personnel. The agreement allegedly included provisions requiring Yugoslavia to completely erase all evidence of its space program from official records and to prevent any participants from discussing their work. The film supported these claims through multiple fabricated evidence streams. First, it featured interviews with apparent eyewitnesses and experts. These included elderly men claiming to have been engineers on the Yugoslav space program, presenting themselves as aged scientists willing to finally reveal the truth before dying. Actors portrayed American officials who claimed to have participated in the secret negotiations. A woman identified as a historian specializing in Cold War Yugoslavia presented the space program as established fact, citing non-existent archival sources and academic publications. These interviews were filmed in styles appropriate to different types of documentary, some in formal settings suggesting official interviews, others in homes suggesting personal testimony, others in universities suggesting academic authority. Second, the film presented fabricated documents. These included apparent Yugoslav government memoranda discussing space program funding, technical reports on rocket motor testing, and letters between Tito and Kennedy alluding to their secret agreement. The filmmakers created these documents with painstaking attention to period-appropriate paper, typefaces, bureaucratic language, and administrative formatting. They incorporated authentic-looking signatures, stamps, and classification markings. For viewers unfamiliar with the archival research process or unable to verify documents against genuine archival collections, these fabrications appeared entirely convincing. Third, the film incorporated manipulated archival footage. Genuine footage of Yugoslav military parades showing the M-87 Orkan rocket system was edited and presented as if it showed space program hardware. Footage of Soviet rocket tests and launches was intercut with Yugoslav imagery to suggest that Yugoslavia had conducted similar tests. Aerial footage of Zeljava Air Base was presented as showing a space program facility. The editing created visual continuity between disparate elements, constructing a plausible visual narrative of Yugoslav space activities that never occurred. Fourth, the film used audio manipulation and mistranslation to support its narrative. Audio recordings of Tito's speeches were edited to remove context and suggest that he was referring to space exploration when he was actually discussing entirely different topics. Subtitles provided creative translations that introduced space-related content not present in the original language. These techniques exploited the fact that most international viewers did not speak Serbo-Croatian and would rely entirely on provided subtitles. The film's director, Ziga Virc, has been explicit in post-premiere interviews that Houston, We Have a Problem was intended as an artistic exploration of how documentary evidence constructs belief. Virc stated that he wanted to create a film that would be simultaneously a hoax and a commentary on hoaxes, a work that fooled audiences while also revealing the mechanisms through which they were being fooled. The film included subtle clues to its fictional nature, including deliberately absurd statements that attentive viewers would recognize as impossible, anachronistic details that contradicted the claimed timeframe, and stylistic elements that departed from authentic documentary conventions. However, these clues were embedded within an overall presentation that was sufficiently convincing to fool viewers who approached the film expecting factual content. The film generated intense controversy precisely because it succeeded in its goal of blurring truth and fiction. Audience members at Tribeca reportedly debated whether what they had witnessed was real. Online discussions erupted as the film circulated through festival screenings and later through streaming platforms and social media. Some viewers defended the film as brilliant social commentary that exposed how easily people could be manipulated by apparently authoritative sources. Others condemned it as irresponsible, arguing that creating convincing fake history contributed to the erosion of shared factual understanding in an era already plagued by misinformation. Still, others simply believed the film's claims, treating it as a genuine documentary that had revealed suppressed history. The film's reception varied significantly across different audiences. International viewers, particularly those with limited knowledge of Yugoslav history, were more likely to accept the film's claims at face value. Viewers from former Yugoslav republics were more divided. Some, particularly older individuals who remembered the Cold War era and knew that no space program had existed, immediately recognized the film as fiction. Others, particularly younger viewers who had grown up hearing rumors about secret Yugoslav technologies, found the film's narrative plausible or even confirming of what they had suspected. Nationalist commentators in different successor states appropriated elements of the myth, with some Slovenian sources emphasizing Potocnik and claiming the space program as a Slovenian achievement, while some Serbian sources emphasized Tito and claimed it as a Yugoslav or Serbian achievement. Academic responses to the film highlighted its significance as a case study in media manipulation and historical revisionism. Scholars noted that Houston, We Have a Problem represented a new form of documentary practice that challenged traditional distinctions between fiction and non-fiction. The film demonstrated that documentary conventions, including interviews with experts, archival footage, and official documents, could be completely fabricated using accessible technology while remaining visually indistinguishable from authentic materials. This raised troubling questions about how viewers could distinguish legitimate historical documentaries from sophisticated fakes in an era when digital manipulation tools were widely available. The film also demonstrated the power of conspiracy narratives to fill gaps in historical knowledge. For viewers from post-Yugoslav states who had limited access to reliable information about their own history due to state censorship during the communist era, destruction of archives during the wars, and nationalist distortions in contemporary education, the film's narrative provided a coherent, emotionally satisfying story that explained mysteries and validated national pride. The fact that the story was false mattered less than its psychological and political utility. Virc's film tapped into a broader cultural moment in which the concept of truth itself was becoming contested. The mid-2010s saw the emergence of fake news as a major political force, the manipulation of social media to spread disinformation, and growing public skepticism toward expert knowledge and institutional authority. Houston, We Have a Problem both reflected and contributed to this environment. It showed how easily authoritative-seeming content could be manufactured. It demonstrated that debunking required significant effort and expertise that most viewers would not invest. It revealed that for many people, belief was determined not by evidence, but by whether a narrative aligned with their pre-existing assumptions and desires. The film's long-term impact included both intended and unintended consequences. On the intended side, it generated valuable discussions about media literacy, the nature of documentary evidence, and the construction of historical narratives. Film scholars, media theorists, and educators used the film as a teaching tool to help students develop critical viewing skills and question the authority of documentary forms. On the unintended side, the film amplified and legitimized the very myth it was ostensibly examining. The viral trailer from 2012 and the film's subsequent circulation, divorced from critical commentary, meant that many viewers encountered the claims without understanding their fictional nature. The film became, in effect, the most sophisticated piece of evidence supporting the Yugoslav space program myth, used by conspiracy theorists and nationalist mythmakers as proof of what they had always believed. The ethical questions raised by Houston, "We have a problem," remain unresolved. Does creating convincing fake history, even as acknowledged art, constitute irresponsible misinformation? Does the film's artistic merit justify its potential to deceive? Can audiences be expected to distinguish sophisticated fiction from documentary fact when professional conventions are deliberately mimicked? These questions have no simple answers, but they became increasingly urgent as techniques demonstrated in Virc's film were adopted by creators with explicitly propagandistic intentions in political contexts around the world. The pseudo-documentary format pioneered by Houston, "We Have a Problem," represented an evolution in how fiction could be presented as fact. Unlike traditional mockumentaries that used humor and absurdity to signal their fictional nature, Virc's film maintained absolute seriousness throughout. Unlike traditional conspiracy theory documentaries that were produced by believers, this film was created by someone who knew the claims were false, but presented them with the same techniques used in legitimate documentaries. This combination created a uniquely destabilizing viewing experience that forced audiences to question not just the film's specific claims, but the entire framework through which documentary evidence constructs knowledge about the past. What did Yugoslavia really do in space? Canonical science versus fiction. Separating fact from fiction regarding Yugoslav involvement in space-related activities requires careful examination of verifiable primary sources, including government budgets, scientific publications, declassified intelligence reports, and contemporary journalistic accounts. This analysis must distinguish between what Yugoslavia actually accomplished, what it attempted but failed to achieve, what it theoretically could have done with different resources, and what has been falsely attributed to it. The canonical record shows that Yugoslavia made limited but genuine contributions to space science through individual scientists and through participation in international research collaborations, while never developing an indigenous space program capable of satellite launch or beyond-Earth missions. Yugoslavia's government budgets from 1945 through 1991 are preserved in various archives in the successor states, and these documents show no evidence of significant funding for space research. The Yugoslav defense budget allocated substantial resources to conventional military forces, including the Air Force, Navy, and Army, as well as to indigenous weapons production. Spending on military research and development focused on tactical systems, including tanks, artillery, small arms, aircraft, and rocket weapons. Scientific research funding supported institutions like the Ruda Bošković Institute and various university physics departments, but these allocations were modest compared to defense spending and were dedicated to fundamental research rather than applied space technology. No line items exist for satellite development, launch vehicle construction, or space mission infrastructure. The scientific output of Yugoslav researchers provides another measure of actual space-related activities. Academic databases containing physics and engineering publications from Yugoslav institutions during the Cold War show participation in cosmic ray research, some theoretical work on orbital mechanics, and contributions to international projects monitoring solar radiation and magnetospheric phenomena. These publications demonstrate that Yugoslav scientists engaged with space science as observers and analysts of data collected by other nations' spacecraft. They do not show development of indigenous space hardware, launch capability, or mission planning. The volume of space-related publications from Yugoslav institutions was comparable to that from other medium-sized European countries without independent space programs, such as Austria, Finland, or Greece. Yugoslav participation in international space science occurred primarily through memberships in international organizations and through individual scientists working abroad. Yugoslavia participated in the Committee on Space Research, known as COSPAR, an international scientific organization established in 1958 to facilitate space research cooperation. Yugoslav scientists attended COSPAR conferences and contributed to working groups on topics including solar physics and the upper atmosphere. This participation was valuable for Yugoslav science and contributed to international knowledge, but it did not require or demonstrate capability to launch satellites or conduct independent space missions. Individual Yugoslav scientists who emigrated made the most significant Yugoslav contributions to actual space programs. Milojko Mike Vucelic, mentioned earlier, worked on Apollo systems management at NASA and Rockwell International. His expertise in systems engineering and problem-solving contributed to mission success, particularly during the Apollo 13 crisis when rapid improvisation saved the crew's lives. Vucelic represents a common pattern of brain drain from Yugoslavia and other countries with limited research infrastructure to the United States and Western Europe, where greater resources and opportunities existed. These individuals' achievements reflect their personal capabilities and the opportunities provided by American institutions rather than the capabilities of Yugoslav institutions. The question of whether Yugoslavia ever attempted to develop space capabilities requires distinguishing between aspirational proposals and funded programs. Archival research by historians has uncovered some evidence that Yugoslav military planners in the 1960s conducted preliminary studies of potential military applications of space technology, particularly reconnaissance satellites. These studies were theoretical exercises examining whether satellite surveillance might provide military advantages and what such a program might cost. The studies concluded that Yugoslavia lacked the resources to develop independent satellite capabilities and that purchasing imagery from commercial sources or obtaining it through intelligence exchanges would be more cost-effective. No evidence suggests that these preliminary studies advanced beyond the conceptual stage to actual hardware development or testing. The M-87 Orkan and other Yugoslav rocket systems have been systematically mischaracterized in the space program myth, requiring clear explanation of their actual capabilities and purposes. The M-87 Orkan was a multiple-launch rocket system that entered service in 1983. The system consisted of a truck-mounted launcher with 12 tubes, each loaded with a 262mm rocket. The rockets had a maximum range of approximately 50 kilometers and carried submunitions designed to saturate target areas. The rocket motors used solid propellant and burned for approximately 10 to 15 seconds, after which the rocket followed a ballistic trajectory to its target. The system was designed for rapid deployment, firing its full salvo in less than 1 minute, then relocating to avoid counter-battery fire. The technical gap between the M-87 Orkan and a space launch vehicle is enormous and must be precisely understood. The Orkan rocket had a total mass of approximately 800 kilograms, of which approximately 480 kilograms was propellant. It achieved a maximum velocity of approximately 1,000 meters per second and reached a maximum altitude of approximately 30 kilometers. By contrast, achieving low Earth orbit requires accelerating a payload to approximately 7,800 meters per second at an altitude of at least 200 kilometers. The kinetic energy required for orbital velocity is approximately 60 times greater than the kinetic energy of an Orkan rocket. Scaling rocket systems is not linear. A rocket 60 times more powerful than the Orkan would require fundamentally different design approaches, including multi-stage configurations, liquid propellant engines with much higher specific impulse than solid propellants, guidance and control systems capable of maintaining precise trajectories for minutes rather than seconds, and thermal protection systems to survive atmospheric re-entry. The claim that Yugoslavia could have adapted the Orkan or similar weapons to create space launch capability is analogous to claiming that a country capable of producing handguns could easily produce intercontinental ballistic missiles. Both are technically in the category of rocket weapons, but the engineering challenges differ by orders of magnitude. Yugoslavia never developed liquid fuel rocket engines, which are essential for efficient space launch. Yugoslav rocket systems used relatively simple solid propellants that provided high thrust for short duration, but lacked the efficiency needed for orbital insertion. Yugoslavia never developed the guidance systems, telemetry, or ground control infrastructure required for space missions. The country never built test facilities for evaluating rocket motors in vacuum conditions or for simulating space environments. The Zeljava Air Base, central to the space program myth, has been thoroughly documented by military historians and serves purposes entirely inconsistent with space launch operations. The facility's configuration, including tunnels carved horizontally through a mountain with openings on both sides, is optimized for aircraft storage and rapid dispersal during attack. A space launch facility would require vertical integration buildings for stacking multi-stage rockets, flame trenches to channel rocket exhaust away from the launch pad, propellant storage and fueling systems for cryogenic liquids like liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, tracking stations to monitor launch trajectories, and extensive safety zones to protect personnel from launch failures. None of these elements existed at Zeljava. The facility's location in a populated region near the Croatian-Bosnian border would have been entirely inappropriate for space launches, which are typically conducted from coastal sites where launch failures would crash into ocean rather than onto populated areas. Photographs of Zeljava taken by urban explorers after the Yugoslav wars show aircraft maintenance equipment, fuel storage tanks appropriate for jet fuel rather than rocket propellant, and living quarters for Air Force personnel. The facility's ruins contain no evidence of vertical assembly structures, no specialized equipment for handling cryogenic propellants, no flame deflectors or launch pads, and no control rooms with the specialized equipment required for space missions. The conspiracy claim that all such evidence was removed after the alleged sale to the United States is unfalsifiable, but contradicts the logistical reality that removing massive concrete structures and underground infrastructure would require demolition operations that would themselves have been documented and observed. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, where ethnic divisions continue to shape politics and education, the space program myth is contested terrain. Bosniak, Serb, and Croat communities within Bosnia often receive different educational content and consume different media, leading to different relationships with Yugoslav history. The space program myth can serve as a rare point of potential commonality, a Yugoslav achievement that transcends ethnic division, but it can also be weaponized in debates about whether Yugoslav federation was beneficial or oppressive to different groups. The myth has inspired artistic and cultural production that both perpetuates and interrogates it. Beyond Virc's documentary, other filmmakers, writers, and artists have used the space program as a motif. Some works treat it as alternate history or science fiction, imagining what a Yugoslav space program might have looked like. Others use it as metaphor for lost potential and unfulfilled promises. These artistic engagements contribute to the myth's cultural persistence even as they acknowledge its fictional nature. A myth can remain culturally powerful even after its literal falsehood is established, functioning as a shared reference point and a vehicle for exploring collective anxieties and aspirations. Educational systems in the successor states have struggled with how to address Yugoslav history generally and the space program myth specifically. Some educators use the myth as a case study in media literacy, teaching students to evaluate sources, distinguish fact from fiction, and understand how misinformation spreads. Others avoid the topic entirely, either because they lack resources to address it properly or because it is too politically sensitive. Still others inadvertently perpetuate the myth by presenting it uncritically or by failing to clearly distinguish verified history from legend. Textbooks in different countries present radically different accounts of the Yugoslav period, and the space program myth sometimes appears in marginal forms, with vague references to rumors or claims about secret programs without definitive statements about their veracity. The myth has also influenced how diaspora communities engage with Yugoslav heritage. Emigrants from Yugoslavia and their descendants, living in Western Europe, North America, Australia, and elsewhere, often maintain strong emotional connections to Yugoslav identity, even as the country that defined that identity no longer exists. The space program myth offers a source of pride that can be shared with children and grandchildren growing up outside the Balkans. It provides a counter-narrative to dominant Western accounts of the Cold War that marginalize Yugoslavia's role. For diaspora communities navigating complex identities between their heritage and their countries of residence, myths about Yugoslav achievement serve important psychological functions regardless of their factual accuracy. The long-term impact of the myth includes both harmful and potentially constructive effects. On the harmful side, the myth contributes to erosion of shared factual understanding and normalization of historical misinformation. When people cannot agree on basic facts about their recent past, constructive political dialogue becomes more difficult. The myth also exemplifies how nationalist entrepreneurs can exploit nostalgia and historical ambiguity for political gain. It demonstrates the challenge of maintaining historical accuracy in the digital age, when sophisticated fakes can be produced and distributed globally at minimal cost. On the potentially constructive side, the myth has generated valuable discussions about media literacy, the nature of documentary evidence, and the construction of collective memory. Educators, journalists, and scholars who have engaged critically with the myth have developed pedagogical tools and analytical frameworks that can be applied to other instances of misinformation. The myth serves as a relatively low-stakes case study because, unlike myths about war crimes or political responsibility for violence, it does not directly threaten political stability or interethnic reconciliation. This makes it a useful teaching tool for developing critical thinking skills that can then be applied to more sensitive topics. The myth's persistence also reveals the enduring appeal of the Yugoslav idea for certain populations. Despite the wars, despite the nationalism that drove Yugoslavia's dissolution, and despite decades of separate state development, the space program myth's popularity suggests that significant numbers of people retain positive feelings about at least some aspects of Yugoslav identity. This nostalgia, often called Yugonostalgia, is complex and multifaceted. It reflects genuine loss of economic security that existed in the Tito era, loss of a multi-ethnic ideal that never fully existed but represented aspirational values, and loss of international significance that small successor states cannot match. The space program myth channels this nostalgia into a specific narrative about technological achievement and great power status. As the generation that directly experienced Yugoslavia ages and passes, the space program myth may evolve further. Without living memory to contradict it, the myth might gain credibility among younger people who know Yugoslavia only through family stories, media representations, and internet content. Alternatively, as temporal distance from Yugoslavia increases, the myth might lose relevance as newer generations develop identities less connected to Yugoslav heritage. The myth's future depends on factors including how successor states develop economically and politically, whether European integration provides new sources of collective identity and pride, and whether media and educational institutions invest in historical accuracy or allow misinformation to flourish. The Yugoslav space program myth represents more than just a curiosity about a non-existent space program. It is a window into how collective memory is constructed and contested, how national identities are negotiated in post-communist societies, how media technology shapes information ecosystems, and how psychological needs for dignity and significance can override commitment to factual truth. Its legacy will continue to shape Balkan societies and provide insights for scholars studying misinformation, nationalism, and historical memory in the 21st century. Comparisons to other space hoaxes and myths worldwide. The Yugoslav space program myth exists within a global landscape of space-related hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and alternative histories. Examining this broader context reveals common patterns in how space myths emerge, why they prove appealing, and what they reveal about human psychology and cultural anxieties. Space exploration occupies a unique position in modern consciousness. It represents the apex of human technological achievement. It carries profound philosophical implications about humanity's place in the cosmos, and it was intimately connected to Cold War political competition. These characteristics make space particularly fertile ground for myth-making and conspiracy thinking. The most famous space-related conspiracy theory is moon landing denial, the claim that the Apollo missions did not actually land humans on the moon, and that the televised images were filmed on Earth as propaganda. This conspiracy theory emerged almost immediately after the 1969 Apollo 11 landing and has persisted despite overwhelming evidence of the mission's authenticity. Moon landing denial shares several structural features with the Yugoslav space program myth. Both take real technological achievements and reframe them as hoaxes. Both claim that governments and space agencies systematically deceived the public. Both exploit technical complexities that most people do not understand, allowing conspiracy theorists to claim that certain aspects of the missions were impossible or inconsistent with known physics. However, moon landing denial differs from the Yugoslav myth in crucial ways. Moon landing denial denies something that actually happened, while the Yugoslav myth asserts something that never occurred. Moon landing denial has been extensively debunked by scientists, engineers, and historians who have patiently addressed every technical objection and shown how physical evidence, including moon rocks, retroreflectors placed on the lunar surface, and independent tracking of the missions confirms their authenticity. The Yugoslav myth, by contrast, requires debunking something for which no evidence ever existed, a philosophically different challenge because it involves proving a negative rather than confirming a positive. Nazi space program myths represent another category of space hoaxes with interesting parallels to the Yugoslav case. These myths typically claim that German scientists developed highly advanced rocket technology during World War II that was far ahead of anything the Allies possessed, and that some of this technology was hidden or escaped to remote locations after the war. The most extreme versions claim that Nazis established secret bases in Antarctica or even on the moon where they continued developing advanced spacecraft. These myths take the kernel of truth that German rocket scientists like Wernher von Braun were recruited by both the United States and the Soviet Union after the war and extrapolate it into fantastical claims about Nazi flying saucers and space bases. The Nazi space myths serve different psychological functions than the Yugoslav myth. While the Yugoslav myth provides a source of pride for populations experiencing loss and marginalization, Nazi space myths often appeal to people fascinated by the idea that history's villains possessed secret powers or that the official narrative of World War II is incomplete. These myths also reflect persistent fascination with Nazi aesthetics and technology divorced from moral reckoning with Nazi crimes. The similarity to the Yugoslav myth lies in the technique of taking real technological achievements, in this case, the V-2 rocket program, and expanding them beyond what evidence supports into claims about capabilities that never existed. Soviet space program myths operate somewhat differently because the Soviet program was extensive and did achieve remarkable successes, including the first satellite, the first human in space, and the first spacewalk. However, myths persist about suppressed disasters, cosmonauts who died in failed missions whose records were erased, and technologies that the Soviet Union developed but concealed for security reasons. Some of these claims have basis in fact. The Soviet Union did conceal launch failures and did suppress information about accidents that killed cosmonauts and ground crew. However, conspiracy theorists have taken documented Soviet secrecy and used it to claim that far more extensive cover-ups occurred. The Lost Cosmonauts myth specifically claims that Yuri Gagarin was not actually the first human in space, but rather the first to survive the attempt, with earlier cosmonauts having died in failed missions that were erased from official records. This myth gained traction because the Soviet Union did maintain strict secrecy and did sometimes remove failed cosmonauts from official histories. However, extensive research, including access to Soviet archives after the Cold War, has established that while the Soviet space program had numerous failures and accidents, no evidence supports the claim of secret manned flights before Gagarin. The Lost Cosmonauts myth parallels the Yugoslav space program myth in exploiting gaps in official records and using documented secrecy in one domain to claim secrecy in another. Ancient astronaut theories represent a different category of space myth, claiming that extraterrestrial beings visited Earth in the distant past and influenced human civilization. These theories, popularized by books like Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods, interpret archaeological evidence through the lens of assumed alien intervention. While superficially different from the Yugoslav space program myth, ancient astronaut theories share the characteristic of taking real artifacts and structures and providing alternative explanations that contradict mainstream scientific understanding. Both types of myths appeal to people who distrust expert consensus and prefer explanations that reveal hidden truths inaccessible to ordinary scholars. The persistence of space myths across different cultures and contexts suggests that they serve fundamental psychological needs. Space exploration represents human achievement at its most spectacular, and myths about space programs allow people to participate imaginatively in this achievement or to claim that their group contributed in ways that official histories do not acknowledge. Space myths also express anxieties about technology, government power, and the reliability of official narratives. In an age when governments did develop secret weapons, conduct unethical experiments, and lie to their citizens about matters of national security, skepticism toward official accounts is not entirely irrational. The challenge is distinguishing between healthy skepticism that demands evidence and paranoid conspiracy thinking that rejects evidence in favor of unfalsifiable claims. Space myths also benefit from the technical complexity of spaceflight, which creates opportunities for misleading claims that sound plausible to non-experts. Arguments about rocket thrust-to-weight ratios, orbital mechanics, radiation in space, and photographic anomalies can seem convincing if presented confidently, even when they are based on misunderstandings or deliberate distortions. This technical barrier to debunking gives space myths resilience. Correcting them requires not just asserting the truth, but providing detailed technical explanations that many people lack the background to evaluate. The digital age has dramatically accelerated the spread of space myths, while simultaneously making debunking resources more accessible. YouTube hosts thousands of videos promoting various space conspiracy theories, and these videos often accumulate millions of views. Algorithms that prioritize engagement tend to promote sensational content over sober fact-checking. However, the same platforms also host detailed debunking videos produced by scientists, engineers, and educators. The question is which type of content reaches which audiences, and whether people are motivated to seek out information that challenges rather than confirms their beliefs. The Yugoslav space program myth shares DNA with all these other space hoaxes, while having its own unique characteristics rooted in Balkan history and post-Yugoslav identity politics. Comparing it to other space myths reveals common patterns: the exploitation of real technological achievements as foundations for exaggerated claims, the use of secrecy to explain absent evidence, the appeal to nationalist pride or countercultural skepticism, and the challenge of debunking claims that are technically complex and psychologically satisfying. Understanding these patterns is essential for developing effective strategies to combat misinformation while respecting the legitimate human needs that myths address. The canonical truth, setting the record straight. After examining the Yugoslav space program myth from multiple angles including its origins, its propagation through the pseudo-documentary, Houston, We Have a Problem, its relationship to real Yugoslav technological capabilities, and its cultural and political functions, we can now compile a definitive statement of what is verified, what is uncertain, and what is demonstrably false. This canonical account serves as a reference point for educators, journalists, and anyone seeking to understand the actual history obscured by the myth. Yugoslavia never developed a space program capable of launching satellites or conducting missions beyond Earth's atmosphere. This is not speculation or interpretation, but a fact established through multiple independent lines of evidence. Yugoslav government budgets show no expenditures for space program development. Yugoslav scientific publications show no research on satellite design or launch vehicle engineering. Yugoslav military records show no testing of rockets with orbital capability. Intelligence reports from the United States, Soviet Union, and other countries that monitored Yugoslav capabilities show no awareness of a Yugoslav space program. Physical infrastructure required for space launch, including vertical assembly buildings, propellant storage for cryogenic fuels, flame trenches, and tracking stations, was never constructed in Yugoslavia. No Yugoslav satellite was ever designed, built, or launched. These statements are supported by documentary evidence from multiple national archives and by the absence of any credible contrary evidence. Hermann Potocnik Noordung did make genuine contributions to space station design. Born in 1892 in Pula, he published Das Problem der Befahrung des Weltraums in 1928, presenting designs for a rotating wheel-shaped space station decades before any nation achieved spaceflight. NASA and other space agencies acknowledged his influence on their station designs. A lunar crater is named in his honor. However, Potocnik's work was theoretical, published before Yugoslavia existed as a nation, and did not lead to any Yugoslav institutional space program. Potocnik died in 1929 without witnessing the space age. His legacy is one individual's visionary thinking, not evidence of Yugoslav space capabilities. Yugoslavia did develop military rocket systems, including the M-87 Orkan multiple launch rocket system. These weapons demonstrated Yugoslav capability in rocket motor design, solid propellant chemistry, and fire control systems. However, tactical military rockets differ fundamentally from space launch vehicles in scale, performance, and complexity. The M-87 Orkan achieved ranges of approximately 50 kilometers and altitudes of approximately 30 kilometers using solid propellant motors that burned for 10 to 15 seconds. Achieving orbit requires sustaining thrust for several minutes, reaching velocities exceeding 28,000 kilometers per hour and climbing to altitudes above 200 kilometers. Yugoslavia never developed the liquid fuel engines, multi-stage configurations, guidance systems, or supporting infrastructure required for orbital launch. Zeljava Air Base, designated Objekat 505, was a real underground military facility constructed between 1948 and 1968 in the Vucelic mountain on the Croatian-Bosnian border. The facility featured tunnels that could accommodate approximately 60 aircraft, primarily MiG-21 fighters, along with maintenance facilities, fuel storage, ammunition depots, and personnel accommodations. The base was designed to survive nuclear attack and continue air operations. However, its configuration, location, and equipment were optimized for aircraft operations, not space launch. No evidence exists of rocket assembly facilities, cryogenic propellant systems, launch pads, or space mission control infrastructure at Zeljava. Photographs of the facility's ruins show aircraft maintenance equipment and jet fuel storage, not space program hardware. Josip Broz Tito and President John F. Kennedy did meet during Kennedy's 1963 visit to Yugoslavia. Contemporary news coverage documented discussions about trade, military aid, and Yugoslavia's role in the non-aligned movement. No evidence exists in American or Yugoslav archives of discussions about space technology or of any agreement for Yugoslavia to sell a space program to the United States. The claim that such an agreement existed and was concealed from official records is unfalsifiable and contradicts how classified agreements are actually documented and preserved. Financial records show no unexplained transactions of the magnitude claimed in the myth. Individual Yugoslav-born scientists did contribute to American space programs after emigrating. Mike Vucelic worked on Apollo systems management and contributed to saving the Apollo 13 mission. His achievements reflect personal capability and the opportunities provided by American institutions rather than the existence of a Yugoslav space program. The pattern of individual emigration to participate in foreign space programs is the opposite of what the myth claims. Rather than Yugoslavia transferring technology to America, talented individuals left Yugoslavia to join American programs. Houston, We Have a Problem is a work of fiction created by director Ziga Virc to explore how documentary conventions can construct belief in false narratives. The film deliberately blurs fact and fiction, using fabricated interviews, forged documents, manipulated archival footage, and misleading narration to create the appearance of a genuine documentary investigation. The director has acknowledged that the space program depicted in the film never existed, and that the film was intended as artistic commentary on truth and evidence rather than as factual history. However, the film's viral trailer and subsequent circulation have contributed to belief in the myth among audiences who encountered the content without understanding its fictional nature. The claim that Yugoslavia sold a space program to the United States for $2.5 billion is false. No such transaction occurred because no such program existed to sell. The financial magnitude claimed would have left extensive traces in American budgets, congressional appropriations, and economic effects on Yugoslavia that do not exist. The alleged integration of Yugoslav scientists into Apollo would have required documentation in NASA personnel records, technical specifications, and contractor files that does not exist. The timeline of the alleged deal contradicts the actual development history of Apollo, which built incrementally on previous American programs rather than incorporating foreign technology wholesale. The myth persists not because evidence supports it, but because it serves psychological and political functions. For populations in post-Yugoslav states experiencing economic difficulty, loss of international status, and contested national identities, the myth provides a source of pride and a narrative of lost greatness. The myth channels nostalgia for Yugoslavia and provides an alternative to accounts that emphasize the country's failures and violent dissolution. The myth also demonstrates the challenges of maintaining factual historical knowledge in an era when sophisticated fakes can be produced using accessible technology and distributed globally through internet platforms. The lessons from the Yugoslav space program myth extend beyond this specific case. The myth demonstrates that sophisticated misinformation can fool substantial audiences even when evidence for it is absent and evidence against it is abundant. It shows that myths serve functions beyond truth-seeking and that debunking requires addressing psychological needs as well as providing correct information. It illustrates how fragments of genuine history can be manipulated into comprehensive fictions, and how the absence of evidence can be perversely interpreted as evidence of cover-ups. Effective responses to this myth and others like it require multiple approaches. Educational systems must teach critical thinking skills and scientific literacy that enable students to evaluate extraordinary claims. Media institutions must prioritize accuracy over engagement and invest resources in serious fact-checking. Archival institutions must make historical records accessible so that researchers can verify claims. Public intellectuals and content creators must produce compelling debunking content that reaches audiences beyond those already convinced. Most fundamentally, societies must address the underlying conditions, including economic insecurity, political instability, and identity crises that make myths psychologically necessary for substantial populations. The Yugoslav space program did not exist. This simple truth is obscured by a sophisticated mythology that combines fragments of genuine history, skillful manipulation of documentary conventions, psychological needs for national pride, and information ecosystems that reward sensational claims over sober accuracy. Establishing the truth requires more than stating facts. It requires understanding why myths are appealing and creating conditions in which accuracy can compete with fiction on terms that acknowledge human emotional and political needs. The canonical truth about the Yugoslav space program is clear to those who examine the evidence. The challenge is making that truth as compelling as the myth that denies it. The Yugoslav space program hoax endures because it fulfills deep needs that facts alone cannot address. Until we understand and respond to those needs, myths will continue to flourish regardless of how thoroughly they are debunked. The space program that never existed tells us something true about the societies that imagined it, and in that paradox lies both the myth's power and the key to countering it. If you found this investigation valuable, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations of where truth and myth collide. Thank you for watching.